philosophy, Aristotle's works were not considered to be living philosophy anymore, and the scholars came in and divided the text up and looked at individual passages by themselves. Of course, it's very important to examine individual passages. One can't work on a text without looking at passages very closely. But at the same time, to look at only individual passages and not to understand the larger context of problems is a way of disassembling the text and making it not have the life that it could. What I want to do today is to try to work in the opposite direction. I'm going to raise a problem about the nature of thinking. I'm going to raise actually 4 problems about the nature of thinking. And I want to try to answer those problems by covering a wide range of texts. Now, those of you who know the text of the Anima very well will probably feel, and rightly so, that I'm not spending enough time on any one text, each of which has its own problems. And those of you who don't know the text well may well wonder what the problems are, because things fit together very nicely. At least I hope they do. So what I'm saying is I'm not likely to please anybody here. But nonetheless, I'm going to talk anyway, and you're stuck with me. So there we go. All right. So I want to begin with a problem here. I guess a preliminary. The discussion of thinking is really is the part of the De Anima that has excited most people, but there's actually very little of the De Anima on it. And one of the reasons for that is the De Anima is about the nature of the soul. There are 2 characteristics of the animal soul. One is the possibility of the potential for sensation, and the other one is movement. And a lot of the De Anima, especially Book 3 of the De Anima, which I'm going to be focusing on, is concerned with linking these 2 characteristics. It's in respect of sensation that an animal has movement, because the animal senses its food or it's something else that it's desiring, and it moves towards it, or if it's something that's threatening, it moves away from it. And what Aristotle is trying to do throughout a lot of the book of Book 3 is to link these 2 together. Now, thinking comes in because as thinking beings, we interrupt this sequence, as it were. We have a possibility of pulling ourselves away from the dessert table, or being chased, or not pursuing objects of desire, and pursuing instead other objects that thought represents to us as valuable. So in this sequence of sensation and movement toward or away from the objects of sensation, we have thinking that interrupts it. And for that reason, thinking isn't given the amount of attention that one might like. In general, the account of thinking occurs in a few chapters, in 4 through 7 or 8, and the account of thinking is modeled on the account of sensation. And that's passage number 2 here. I just translated the end of the passage. Just as the sensitive is to the objects of sense, so too is the mind to intelligible objects. Now, I'm just going to sketch the account very quickly. For most of you, it's well known, but it's worth mentioning something about it anyway. So what we have is, we have the sensible object here, and the mind, and let's just call this the world here, and mind. The sensible object has a sensible form, and the sensible form, like the white or the sound, a particular high sound, it exists in a matter. And somehow this form, through our object through our sense organ, this form comes to be in our mind. It comes to be in the sense organ, and we come to recognize it. Now there is a process here. The form is a kind of actuality, And in each case, the actuality acts upon something that's potential and raises the potential to an actuality. So it has to be a medium. The medium carries the form somehow. So when the medium acts upon the sense organ is potentially the form, the sensible form, and its potential is realized and the form comes to be in the sense organ and thereby in our minds. There's a kind of mechanistic process. And this is about as close to a mechanistic account of anything as Aristotle gets. The mind works in a parallel way, and this is the import of the passage. In the case of the mind, there's again an intelligible form that exists in the object. That intelligible form comes to be in the mind. The mind is potentially all forms. It's the form of all forms. It's capable. It's a potential to receive all forms. And likewise, with the sense organ has to be as free as possible of all forms, all sensible forms that it receives, in order to be best prepared to receive the form. The mind has to be a potential for everything in order to receive an intelligible form. So the claim is, again, passage 2, just as the sensitive here, is to the objects of sense, so too the mind is to the objects, the intelligible objects. All right, so this much is fairly clear. What I want to do first is to talk about how this analogy breaks down. A preliminary. There's some sort of a kind of the Aristotelian account explains how knowledge and sensation are possible, how it's possible for the mind to have in it what's in the world, in contrast with the Platonic account and the account of the atomists. According to the atomists, and we have their account from Lucretius, probably the same in Epicurus and Democritus or something similar, these objects are emitting films. And the films they travel through space, through the medium, and they act upon us, and we grasp the thing by being affected by the film. The Platonic account works in exactly the opposite direction. Our eyes are emitting a light, and it's sort of like the blind man with the stick who feels with the stick and is able to sense by means of something that comes from himself. So, if you will, for the atomists, things go in this direction. For Plato, they go in this direction. And in Aristotle, there's a kind of parallel. And it's pretty obvious that for the other two accounts, there can't be any kind of knowledge. You can't be certain that you know that the way that you're affected is the way that the thing is. Nor can you be certain that the way you affect the thing and feel the thing is the way that the thing is. But in Aristotle, we do have knowledge after all. We need to account for the possibility of this knowledge, and the way to account for it is by identifying the form in the thing with the form that's in the mind on both levels. Okay, so that's part of what's motivating the account. What are the problems with the account? Number one, this account of sensation depends, as I said, on a mechanism. And whenever you have an actuality is able to act, by virtue of being an actuality, it's able to act on what's potential. And what's potential is able to receive the form that the actuality is. Now, this is a kind of violation of Newtonian physics, so that's interesting about it. But nonetheless, that's the way it works. Why is it a violation of Newtonian physics? Because the actuality in acting on something doesn't lose one bit of its nature. So if you can take one example is if you imagine lighting a match, bringing it close to a piece of paper, the match has the the lit match is actually fire, actually hot. It acts upon the paper, and the paper becomes hot. So just as the actuality acts somehow upon the medium, and the medium becomes actual, and that actuality is somehow conveyed through the medium, we are potential, and our potentiality is actualized by the medium which carries the actuality of the form. This is a mechanistic account. So here's the problem. There is no mechanism by which the intelligible form could be conveyed to the mind. It doesn't exist in the sensible object. It's intelligible. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the form the form in the sensible object. Well, it makes a little bit of sense. I open my eyes and I see a diversity of objects, but there's one visual field and I see it all together at once. The intelligible form can be grasped all at once. The intelligible form being the essence of the thing that I'm grasping. The essence of the house, the essence of a person, the essential nature of a thing. I can grasp that all at once. What's problematic is that's a very thin view of the nature of thinking and the mind. There's a lot more to thinking than grasping a form. There are propositions, there are arguments, there's reasoning. None of this comes out when you talk about grasping the form. So one of the problems, the second problem here with this account is, in making the analogy between sensation and the intellect, the form here is one, and the form here is one, but what we need to account for in intelligible objects is a kind of a whole variety of different intelligible acts. Making propositions, drawing inferences. And one of the reasons this is particularly problematic is the form, the intelligible form that's here in the mind, can be the intelligible form in the object. That makes sense. But what I have trouble with is when I have a proposition, or even worse, an argument, a syllogism. How is it that the syllogism, the process of reasoning in my mind, can exist in the object? Or, as the problem is sometimes put, why is it that when I draw an inference, I start with a true premise, true premises, I draw the inference, why is it that the inference holds of things in the world? There's the correspondence here between the form in the mind and the form in the thing seems to be too thin, and it seems to fall short. When we try to add something to it that needs to be added, propositions and arguments, syllogisms, it's hard to imagine how they could exist in the things. All right, so those are two problems. Problem number three is a problem that I think I have it here, if I can find it. All right, it's in passage number 8, and I see that I actually didn't translate it, but it's the last line of the Greek, and the conclusion that he draws is, therefore, it's never the case that the mind thinks without images, without imagination. And the question is, why is it that the mind needs imagination? Now, imagination is a faculty of images, and the images are sensible images. So this claim that the mind needs images seems to undermine the analogy, because instead of saying that just as sensation is, so too is the intellect, it seems that the intellect, the mind, requires the images that are from sensation. So there seems to be a point of disanalogy by virtue of this claim. It's hard in itself to understand, but it also suggests a third point of disanalogy. And the fourth problem that I want to raise is a textual problem. It has to do with Book Gamma, Chapter 6. This is a question, a brief discussion of truth and falsity. And in the middle of this discussion, Aristotle starts talking about dividing mathematical objects. And this is a textual problem because it seems to be completely out of place in this discussion. There isn't any reason to talk about mathematical objects, it seems, at this point in the text. So those are the four problems that I want to raise, and I want to begin to answer them by talking about the last problem that I mentioned. This discussion of mathematical objects. And in general, the modern scholarly approach is when we have something that doesn't quite fit, what do? It must be a later addition to the text. I think oftentimes the things that seem not to fit are really the keys to understanding what's going on in the text. So this discussion is passage, let's see here. It starts with passage 3. Thinking of what is undivided occurs in that about which there is no falsity. Where there is truth or falsity, there is some combination of thoughts into a unity. So too, what had been separate are combined as incommensurable and diagonal. Falsity always lies in synthesis. It's also possible to say that they all involve division. And this is the important line here. What makes each one is the mind. This is the beginning of chapter 6 of book 3 of Book Gamma of the Anima. And it's about truth and falsity and combination. That makes sense to talk about that. Then he goes on, and this is what I really had in mind here. From here, the next lines are, since the undivided is so in two ways, potentially or actually, nothing prevents one from thinking, and I put the numbers in here, the undivided when one thinks a length, for it's undivided in actuality and in thought in an undivided time, and is thought in an undivided time, for time is divided or undivided with the length. So it's impossible to say what one was thinking in each half time. These did not exist before it was divided, except potentially. If though one thinks of two each half separately, then one divides time as well, and supposes that the halves are lengths. And if one thinks of three what's constituted out of both halves, one does so in the time composed of both times. So as I understand the passage, there are three ways to think the line. We have a line here, and this is an idea that occurs elsewhere in Aristotle, particularly in the physics. The line is grasped as a line. There's a form that it has, and we grasp it all at once as a line. But the line is potentially divisible. And we can put a point and divide the line here into two. Once we've done that, we've now actualized the line's potential to be two line segments. And we can think one of them after another. So we've not only divided the line, but we've divided the time in which we think the line. We've divided it into two separate bits. Furthermore, we can recognize that those two separate line segments are really part of one line. So we can think them together as two parts of a single line. So the three ways to think of it are the line as a whole, as one, the two parts as separated from each other, one after another successively, and the two parts as part of a composite line, all together as one. All right. Doesn't seem to have anything to do with the rest of the Anima, but let's look at what follows it here. This is the next passage. Oops, went too far. What's divided not in quantity but in form, one thinks in an undivided time with an undivided part of the soul. However, what one thinks and the time in which thought can be divided accidentally. For in these there's something undivided, but perhaps not separate, that makes the time and the length one. And this is alike in all continuous things, both time and length. It's a little bit mysterious, and I could spend more time talking about it, but I'll do it quick. I'll suggest an interpretation of it. We can regard the line not just as a quantity that's potentially divisible. We can regard the line as a form. We can talk about the nature of the line. And when we do that, we grasp the line all at once as a single thing, as a line. The line could have an attribute. It's a straight line. Line isn't quite straight, or it's a curved line. We can grasp the attribute and the line together. Now, when we make an assertion, we combine a subject and a predicate. The line is straight. The line is curved. There are two things that we put together. The mind makes them one. But the mind makes them one because they are one somehow in reality. What I want to suggest is this idea of the line being potentially divisible. That's a quantitative representation of something that Aristotle is understanding as parallel to a formal division. The division between the essential nature of the line and an attribute that the line might have. And just as the thing and the attribute exist as one in the thing, the mind is able to grasp one of them after another and recognize that two of them go together or don't go together. And in doing that, we are able to make these two one in something of the same way that we can take the two parts of the line, which originally are together, have become divided. We can put them together and grasp them as a single entity, which they were from the start. So let me try it again here. We perceive the nature of the entity, and we perceive the attribute. We perceive, the mind recognizes them as distinct entities. But in the thing, in the world, they were together. We got them separately. We have the ability somehow to put them together and reconstruct the original unity as it exists in the object. The mind makes the unity. In making the unity, it reconstitutes what was already there. Now, all right, straight and curved lines are not so interesting, but as Aristotle goes on, actually it was right at the beginning of the chapter and I read it already, there's an example about the diagonal and being incommensurable. Those things go together necessarily. The diagonal of the square is incommensurable with the sides. Right? Everybody knows that. Square root of 2 can't be put as represented as a ratio of two whole numbers. They're incommensurable. what we can do is recognize that these two things go together as they are in nature. And in doing that, what I'm suggesting is we have the mental ability to reconstitute a unity, the unity that exists in the thing. And this unity here, it's a form, sort of. It's really a, right? It's really a proposition. The unity that's here exists in the object. Here it exists actually. It's potentially divided into parts. We receive it through our minds in that part form, but we put it together. We combine the two parts, and truth is the agreement of our minds with this object. All right, so we have a way here, by using this passage in chapter 6, we have a way of understanding how it is that the form in the mind really corresponds to the form in the thing. And so far, I think I've covered some ground that Kurt Prinzel has covered, so it's not so new, but we can go a little bit further here. We have the same problem with reasoning. I mentioned this before. How is it possible to understand the reasoning that occurs in the mind as somehow corresponding to something that's in the object? Well, the solution is exactly parallel to understanding the nature of truth. In the on interpretation, Aristotle talks about propositions as having a subject and a predicate. They're two terms. In the prior analytics and the posterior analytics, Aristotle talks about syllogisms. Syllogisms have three terms. The three terms of the syllogism, at least in the scientific syllogism, the one that yields knowledge, the three terms constitute a kind of unity. And I have some passages here to indicate that, in case you don't believe me. If I can find them here. Okay, so 10, the one is the principle of knowledge in regard to each thing. The one is not the same in each genus. And this is that's from the metaphysics and posterior analytics of what is one. Insofar as it's one, there's one knowledge, or one science, is sometimes translated. And let's see here. On the number 13, on interpretation, signifying one thing in respect of one thing constitutes a single affirmation or denial. Man is white, and there's a stronger relation here of a necessary truth, which I didn't quote here. Yeah, the passage 14 is about the general passage about a syllogism, and in 15 he talks about there not being possible to have an infinite number of middle terms. So I didn't actually give you the right passage here, so you will have to take my word for it. Sorry. He does say that the three terms of a syllogism constitute a kind of unity. So what we have then in the syllogism is exactly parallel to what we have in the proposition. Just as the two terms in the proposition, right, the diagonal and the incommensurable, are necessarily linked, and they form a unity that we grasp to be a unity, even though we have to put them together to see that they're a unity. So too with the syllogism. The three terms of the syllogism, the outer and the two outer terms and the middle term, form a kind of unity. We grasp the terms individually, and it takes a lot of work. In fact, just to make a broad sweeping statement here, as if I haven't made it enough of that already, the organon is all about how to work with those things, individual things that we are presented with, and to reconnect them into the original unities that they have in the world. And the syllogism is such a unity. So we thought we were grasping only a form, but the first step was to see that the form that we grasp is the unity of a proposition. The second step is to see that it's the unity of a syllogism. And those three terms constitute a kind of form that exists in the thing. Now, this is really a pretty powerful idea, because the reasoning that we undertake, when we get it right, when we have a scientific syllogism, the reasoning that we undertake really does correspond to relationships that exist in things in the world. And the way that those relationships exist is with a kind of original unity that's potentially divided into the three terms of the syllogism. We are, as I said, initially presented with the individual terms, and our job is to reconstitute them into a single entity. All right, so with this, I've answered one of the questions that we began with. It seemed like the account of thinking is too thin because he only's talking about a form here and a form here. But when we understand chapter 6 in the right way, we can see that the form is not just an essential nature. It's the essential nature plus the essential attributes plus sometimes the essence that links plus the thing whose essence and various other essential attributes that are linked together in the thing. Okay, so much for one of the problems. Let's see if we can go a little bit deeper here. In order to grasp a intelligible form, Aristotle claims, we need to have the imagination. What role could the imagination possibly be playing? I said it's undermining the analogy, which seems to suggest that these two processes are independent and parallel. This process depends on this process. In what way is the imagination necessary? What I want to suggest is that the answer to this question depends on an argument in the metaphysics, an argument that was also for a long time considered to be a kind of inessential addition that didn't really fit in with the metaphysics. Jaeger, a century ago, wrote that there's a doublet, zeta 12 and eta 6 of the metaphysics, are two parallel discussions. Neither of them actually fit in. They were probably included in a scroll someplace and sewn into the text at some place where somebody thought that they might make some sense. I've argued that actually the argument in eta 6 is really a high point, an essential part of the metaphysics. And I think that the argument is necessary to understand what's happening here. First of all, in Book 1 of the Anima, at the end of Book 1, there's an argument about the soul that is more or less the same argument, but it's not used in the same way. Aristotle is asking, what is the nature of the soul? He says, well, it can't be reduced to something that's material. Why not? I've got a couple of material things. What is it that holds these material things together? Now, I can't say that it's another material thing, because if I do, I'm going to have exactly the same problem. What is it that's going to hold all of those material things together? Well, if I pose another material thing, again, the problem arises, I have an infinite regress. I've got to say that there is something else, something that's immaterial, that is the basis of the unity of the material things. And that something that's immaterial is the soul. And he goes on to talk about the soul in the rest of the De Anima. But the argument, almost the same argument, appears in the metaphysics. What is the essential nature of a sensible ousia, sensible substance? It can't be a material part, because I could have all the parts, all the material parts, and not have the sensible ousia. What I need is those parts to be assembled, and I need the parts to be functioning. There has to be something that's immaterial, that is the basis for the unity of the sensible ousia. And that something is what he calls form, and I've already said that a form is an actuality, which is another way of saying that, well, think of it this way. The house is made of bricks and boards and various other things. I can have them all lying on the ground someplace. I don't have a house. It's not until I assemble them that I have a house. Well, it's not until they have the order and structure in respect of which they can function that they're a house. It's because they can provide shelter that they're a house. And we recognize that. How do we recognize it? By, first of all, knowing the parts, but recognizing how the parts not just fit together, but function together. So what I want to suggest is, it's this idea in the metaphysics that is behind the claim that in order to think about an object, we need to have an imagination. We need to have images. What does thinking about an object consist of? It consists of grasping the essential nature, the form. But the form is not any of the material images. Right? Not any of the material objects which can be represented by images. The form is what connects those material objects together. Think of it this way. How do you understand a house without walls, without a roof? It can't do its job without those material constituents. The way we understand the house is by grasping the material constituents, which we represent in our imaginations, and understanding somehow, thinking that those material constituents aren't the house, but it's their structure and order which allows them to function together that makes the house. It's through grasping the order and function of the material constituents that we come to see what the essential nature of the house is. So we can talk about the essential nature apart from the material. We can separate it in our mind, but there's no house without some material things that are going to perform the function. Likewise with most everything in the sensible world. There's no cow without the various cow parts that work together and perform the function of the cow, whatever that is. We might be an exception because of our minds, but that's problematic in itself. All right. So why is it that we need the imagination? Because the imagination supplies us with the sensible constituents of the things, and it's the order and structure of them and their function together that allows us to grasp the essential nature of the thing. Without the imagination, we wouldn't be able to think the essential nature. Why imagination, though? Why not just sensation? Because one of the things that we have to do in grasping the form of the thing is to recognize what is it that's in the object that's essential to it. Right? Paint a house has a color, you paint it a different color, it's still a house. Take off the roof, not a house anymore. It's not going to shelter you from the elements. It's that imagination, that imagining, that taking of the parts, disassembling them, putting them together, that allows us to see what is it that's really, what the function is and what is the essential character of the object. All right. Now, if this account is right, we've answered another problem. One of the points of disanalogy was that there's no medium in the case of the intellect. In Book 2 of the De Anima, Aristotle makes a big point of showing in the case of each sensation, there's a sensible object and there's a medium. It's tough in the case of touch. That's That's not obvious. But in the other ones, it's more obvious, and he insists, nonetheless, in touch it has to be present too. There's no medium here. But wait, there is a kind of medium. And the medium is the sensible object, the sensible forms that we grasp in imagination. Okay? Now, there's an obvious problem here. Because even though the imagination acts as a kind of medium through which the intelligible form is conveyed, there is no basis for agency here. In this case, the sensible form is an actuality, and it acts as an agent to actualize the medium. The intelligible form, well, it is actualizing the sensible form, but it's not the agent. It's not acting as an agent to convey itself to us. It's rather we who have to grasp the intelligible form in the imagination. And I just said something about the process that we use. Imagine the house without the roof. We imagine the house with different color. We can see certain characteristics are essential, certain characteristics are not essential. The agency is coming from us. Now, that's problematic, because the mind is the potential to be all forms. And you don't get a potential that acts without an agent to act upon it. In order for us to exercise the agency through which we can discover the intelligible forms in the objects of perception and in our imaginations of the objects of images of the objects of perception, in order for us to do so, we need another agency. Well, it's obvious now where I'm going. Our intellect is potentially all forms. In order for the potential to be realized, there has to be an agency. There is no agency in the sensible object that can do the job. Clearly, we need to look for another agent. And the answer, as everybody knows, I'm sure, is there has to be an active intellect that is acting upon us. It's discussed in chapter 5 very briefly, much too briefly, and it's very difficult to understand what he has to say about it there. But I think if we work through the problem in the way that I've done today, the nature of the active intellect makes some sense, and it's clear why Aristotle really needs to rely on an active intellect. We have this amazing ability, this ability to recognize truths in the world. And in order for us to do so, our potential for knowledge has to be actualized by something that's already actual. The only place that there is such an actuality, it's not in us, not in anything that not in the object. The only place that there is such an actuality would be in an actuality that was always acting, and that's the actuality of the active intellect. So I started out with an account and a parallel, and I have 4 problems. I think we've answered all the problems here. There isn't really a parallel here, except it's not quite parallel. There isn't the agency here, but the agency, right, it comes someplace else. And they work in the same way, only differently. But nonetheless, there's something, I think there's, it's hard to convey this in a short time. There's something really beautiful about this account. He's explaining how it's possible for us to have knowledge of the world, and how it's possible for us to grasp the things in the world in our mind. And not only do those things have to be in our minds as forms, but the very process of reasoning about those things has to be in our minds as well, parallel to the forms. And not only that, we have to make this effort. It's not like seeing, where you open your eyes and there it is. The object impresses itself upon you. It's up to us to recognize the agency and to engage in the activity ourselves. At the end of the Anima, Aristotle talks about touch as what's most common to animals. It's a sharp contrast with the metaphysics. In the metaphysics, it begins by talking about how all men desire to know, and we value our senses. And the proof of that is the value that we put on seeing, because seeing provides the most amount of knowledge, and we value this. We need touch to survive as animals. It's because we eat and we come into contact with things that we can sustain ourselves. But we need sight and we need our minds to be the human animals that we are. Thank you. So should I take questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a couple questions. I think they're related. One has to do with the idea that our first intelligible grasp of something is something divided, subject and a predicate, premises of an argument, and that the problem then is to put them back together. It seems to me that one can imagine conceiving things as a whole, and then at some point that whole falls apart into a subject and a predicate, or the premises of a conclusion that we grasp as a whole initially. And then the problem that we have is the reverse of the one that you presented. The other, and I think it's related issue, has to do with whether an active intellect is necessary, or whether the intelligible object itself can provoke the source of its intelligibility. For example, you gave the illustration of a roof. We imagine a house apart from a roof, and then at that point we understand that the roof is essential to the being of the house. If in a storm the roof is blown off, then I may come to see, not by virtue of any imagination on my part, but by an event in nature, what it is that makes a house, aside from a heap of wood. So I wonder how you would respond, A, to the question of whether our initial grasp is a grasp of things divided, and B, whether one needs to posit something like an active intellect, or whether it is not possible to see an analogous process at the level of intellection as that an agency in the realm of things that's the job.
Okay, thank you. So the two questions, if I understand them, or is it the case that we perceive the parts first and reassemble them, or might it not be rather that we receive the whole as a whole, perceive the whole as a whole, and we divide it up? And the second question is, perhaps the object itself provokes our intellect, as in the case of the storm that comes and blows off the roof of the house, and we recognize from the missing roof that there's something essential missing in the house. Okay, so they are connected, the two questions. I can almost answer them the same way. It might be the case that we do perceive the whole, right? The animal, you go to the farm and you see the cow, so you perceive a whole. And it takes a little while to understand that the cow has various cow features, things that are distinctive about cows, and you do have to break them down. So sometimes it's the case that we do see the whole thing first, and then we come to recognize the parts. A lot of times, though, we see an object a part at a time. And it's lots of animals have, we see animals have various organs for taking in food. And it's up to us to somehow recognize that there is something really essential to animals about having such an organ. So we often see the parts first and put them together. So that's my answer to that. Sometimes yes, most of the time probably no. The second part is, yeah, the roof blows off the house, and we recognize that was an essential thing. The rain comes in and something is missing that's important here, but somebody had to have the idea of what a house is before the house was made. And so it had to be understood already. So again, yeah, maybe sometimes, but for the most part, what we need to grasp we want to take care of this problem in advance. You don't want to wait till your roof blows off before you discover that the roof is an essential part of the house here. You want to make sure that it's fastened securely, and you want to recognize what the house is supposed to do before you build. You need to do that before you build it. So I don't think that the object itself will provoke us. And if you doubt that, just think about how unprovoked many students in introductory philosophy courses are. All men by nature desire to know. You wonder, how come my students aren't like that? If the objects really were provoking us, I think they would be like that. Yeah, go ahead.
This actually brings up the third of my question, and that is, it seems to me that we have a conflation of two things here: knowing and building, and the house is a good example of that. Knowing what a house is and building a house. Now, to build a house, you have to know what it is you're trying to build. But to know a house, maybe it's a different thing. Maybe it's significant that Aristotle should conflate knowing and building, and that's worth the thought. But your response to that?
Yeah, in the physics, he distinguishes the art of using from the art of making. So the art of making is the art of building, of course. The art of using is what governs the art of making. His example is the rudder in the ship. You have to know what the rudder is doing in the ship before you're able to construct a rudder that's going to do the job. And this grasp of the art of using, I think, is a way of saying you have to know what the function of the object is. So it seems to me that Aristotle's pretty clear when it comes to that the grasp of the whole and its function precedes the grasp of the making. Yeah? Answer your question?
Well, yes. There are others, but
Okay. All right. Thank you. Tim?
I just want to be clear on what you think the exact role is going to be taught to.
I like your effort to link it with the phantasma being sort of medium.
Yeah.
But then that would suggest very strongly that the age intellect is up to bringing something forth out of that, like just like plant, like the sun, like color. So that would seem to suggest that mind, if it's part of our mind, perhaps, or think mind, its function is to render things intelligible by acting on the imagination, and that turns out to be a very problematic claim.
I don't think it's acting on I think it's acting on our intellect, and our intellect is potentially all things. But we have.
You don't have an act on the imagination, so actually abstraction
No. We are acting on the imagination. Our intellect is acting on the imagination. The imagination is down here.
Yeah.
It's part of this whole system here. We got the images over here.
Intelligible is what? The content of what's in the thing of the imagination, or is it not some distinct mind?
So what was the question?
A primitive intelligible, say dog or white, to use a very simple example.
Yeah.
That is that primitive object that we first think. Is it an content that's in the object's imagination, distinct content? And if it's not distinct, then why do you need agency at all? And why is there anything between sensible and intelligible? Right?
Okay, so we see a dog here, and it has various dog features. We recognize it. Looks like it's down here. Right? There's a sensible object, and we have an image of the sensible object in our mind. But that image of the sensible object is not the essential nature of the dog. So the problem is, how do we go from this picture of the dog being able to recognize, this is a dog, this is not a dog, how do we go from recognizing the sensible object to grasping the essential nature of it?
Right.
Okay? So what do we have? We've got a bunch of sensible characteristics. Dogs, my knowledge of dogs is going to be quickly exhausted here, but I know that they bark, and they have 4 legs, and they have tails. Most of them do anyway. Okay? That's it. I mean, that's it. I don't know what else. Lots of other things have those characteristics as well. But if I wanted to have a science of dogs, what I would be looking for is, what is it that unites all of those sensible characteristics into a single object? Now, some dogs are brown, some dogs are black. That doesn't matter. That's accidental. But if I've got a dog that doesn't bark, well, that's more interesting. There are some dogs apparently that don't bark, it's interesting why they're called dogs. But and this is Aristotelian biology, right? Everything falls neatly into species, except when you actually go and do the examinations. Go to the field, and you find that there's a lot of overlap, and that nothing is really very neat. But let's just talk about dogs and assume that it is possible to know the essential nature of a dog. Right? This is something, since I see Father Whipple in the front row here, I have to say, Thomas Aquinas thinks it wasn't possible to do it. It's beyond our knowledge. We couldn't do it. That's why it failed. So, okay, that he may well be right. I can't do it, that's for sure. But here's how Aristotle envisions it being done. I've got all these sensible characteristics. Some of them are accidental, and some of them are not. The accidental ones I throw out. I've got all the essential ones. Now what I want to know is, what is it that unites all of these things into one object? How is it that they all function together?
Well, you make it sound like it's some interrogative, self-interrogative process.
That's right.
But this doesn't sound very much like light. It sounds a lot like the posture and letters. It doesn't sound a lot like 3, 5, 3, 6, 9.
What 3.5 is doing is telling us that it's providing the motivation to do the work. Okay, look, where do the forms come from? Here. Where is it? In order to get, there's a general claim in Aristotle. You don't get a potential that gets actualized without an actuality of the same sort. So if we come to know the intelligible form, there has to be an intelligible form that's acting upon our minds that causes the potential to be actualized. And it can't be here. Right? Despite previous question, as far as I can see, as far as Aristotle makes clear, it can't be here. It's got to be someplace else. It's got to be over here.
But when we come to know things, it's going to be a feature of the world, right?
That's right.
Okay. So something like is there?
Something, you mean something like this
Right,
is...
in other words, if there were no identity between the sensible characteristic and intelligent form,
That's right.
our knowledge wouldn't be the thing to be from other worlds, from other realities.
Well, don't say sensible characteristics are down here again. Here,
Yeah.
there has to be an identity between the intelligible form
Right.
in the thing and the intelligible form as it exists in us.
Right. So is that the link to the imagination or not? That's trying to
Right. Look, you go back to the house again. Okay, we have the walls and the boards and the bricks and the roof and all of the parts. If they're all lying on the ground, we don't have a house.
Right.
What we need to do is assemble them somehow. And once they're assembled, they can function. They have the potential to function to provide shelter. That potential to function to provide shelter, that's not something you don't really, it's not a sensible characteristic. It's something that you understand. Right? You can see it happening, right? It's raining, let's go inside the house here. You you become aware of it over a period of time. But once you become aware of it, what you grasp is something that's grasped all at once, something that's not material. Now, if it's not material, it's not sensible. So we've took various material parts, we found what holds them together, and we jumped up here. Now, the problem is there's an agent that gets us to see the material object. There's the form that exists here, acts on the medium, it's an actuality, and the medium acts on our sense organ, and we see the boards and the bricks and so forth. But there isn't an agent over here. And we need to supply an agent. Well, what does the agent have to have? It's got to have the actuality that we attain. So we need this active intellect.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, look, on that, on what you just said,
yeah.
We dump the imagination, it's just that point. We just have a transfer of intelligible forms from the active mind to the passive mind. And that's just what some of the commentators suggest. Quite rightly so, it seems, because it seems like the imagination is going to be a precondition to go on.
No, look. Well, what do you have? How do you, if we're talking about a house, how do you get rid of the boards and the bricks and stick with the sheltering? You don't have shelter by grasping an intelligible form. We can't, that doesn't do it. It's not going to protect you from the rain.
Well, I mean, is that really true? I mean, when Aristotle gives that example in metaphysics, he talks about proteating, right? There's the form of the house. It's just the form of the house. It prescinds from any particular material.
Yes, right, with the qualification,
yeah.
Beginning of 801, in thought. Right. It's separable in thought,
right.
But it doesn't exist apart from the things. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it. That's the point. That's why you don't have it without the imagination. You always have the imagination there. You can. Okay, let's talk about. We can separate it in thought, but it doesn't exist. Its reality isn't it? I think I'm taking your question to be, look, if I can separate it in thought, then I don't really need the things anymore, and I can do away with the imagination at the same time.
Right. You might say, well, I mean, my real question was whether there's any agency going into the fabric of imagination from the case. That was my original question. Some people hold that there is. Interpreters very happy. Some people hold that there isn't.
Mm-hmm. We have to refer back to chapter 5, that this agency acted upon us, and now in chapter 6, our intellect can take these various things and make true propositions.
Thank you. I think I do understand. Can I ask one other question?
Yes.
What was in chapter 6, which we went through in those 3 stages?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Those 3 stages to be kind of parable about 3 stages that take place where we make kind of assertions?
Yes. Yes. I wouldn't say 3 stages, because that suggests for us, look, we get into the process usually at stage 2. What I'm suggesting is, in the object, we have a unity here. But in many cases, what's one in the object comes to us through our sensations as a plurality. And our job is to take these 2 parts of the line that we perceive independently at different times, and to recognize that they belong to the same line. That what we have grasped as 2 is in reality 1. Okay, so the question is, if I understand it, is whether or not in this process, whether it could be the sort of mechanical process that I described it as, or whether there's not some sort of spiritual, as you put it, or intelligible dimension that's not entering into this process. Okay, and this is another a question I think that has been discussed by medieval commentators. So I will be risking something here, but I'll stick my neck out and say I think that there was a kind of motivation in the Middle Ages to make as much of the process of cognition to be dependent upon a divine source as possible. It was just one of the motivations there. I think in Aristotle, what we're doing is not so different from what dogs and cats are doing. The dog smells the meat, and the dog is making a kind of judgment about the meat, its food, and going after it. Now, what's different is, we smell the meat and we say, well, I'm a vegetarian, or I don't want to, I'm full, I don't need it. We are able, we have a process where we can somehow intervene and prevent our affirmation of the judgment, or our denial, or fleeing from the object. It's pretty scary, but I've got to defend my city, and I'm going to stand up to it anyway. So I think that as I understand it, the answer to your question is, what we need an account that functions on two levels. It's got to be able to explain why animals do what they do, and it also has to be able to explain why we do what we do and why we're different from animals, and can somehow break the chain of causality between seeing the object that is desirable and pursuing the object. Because there are lots of desirable objects that we choose not to pursue for various reasons that have to do with our being natures of a higher sort. So if you take what you're suggesting, I don't think we can make that distinction. So in the back? Yeah. Wait, we already said it's no place, so, yeah. Right. Right. Correct.
Okay. But there's another way of thinking it. Maybe my view is corrupted by Aquinas. But is it
corrupted? Did I hear this correctly? Corrupted by Aquinas? You mean improved by Aquinas, don't you? Surely you mean that.
the way you're setting up the argument assumes that what the agent intellect acts on is LMI. But if you suppose that what the agent intellect acts on is the phantasm, thereby rendering that intelligible, something if that were the case, then the agent would be our mind, but the phantasm, wherever they are. And therefore, the agent could be a power of our mind, because it isn't acting on itself, it's acting on the phantasm. So I just want to clarify that. So is that right? So in other words, it's important to your position that what is acted on by the agent intervenes that capacity that we're not phantasm.
That's an interesting question, because I wouldn't. The question is whether the active intellect acts on the phantasms, or does it act on our mind, which is a passive, as I'm taking it, it's a passive intellect. And that's an interesting question, because I wouldn't have thought that would be Aquinas' view. I mean, there are plenty of people here who could correct me, so I will take it as Aquinas' view. But it doesn't seem to me to be very plausible. And the reason I would say it's not plausible is we have to do a lot of work to figure out what the essential nature of anything is. And there's a token of that work that we have to do is the organon. This is a huge bit of the Aristotelian corpus. And it's all, as I'm reading it, it's all devoted to how it's possible for us to come to grasp something as the essential nature, and through that essential nature, grasp the essential attributes that a thing has. So this is, it's not easy, because it's when we confront things in the world, it's not easy to sort through what's essential, what's accidental, what it is that makes the thing be what it is. And we already brought up here that it's not clear, and I think here Aquinas, I think, really is right. It's not clear that Aristotle succeeded in doing ever doing this with anything. We can't do it. I can't do it with a dog. It doesn't seem that Aristotle can do it either. He makes a number of much broader claims about the essential nature of animal life. That's much more plausible, and that's more interesting in a way than any individual species. But a lot of work goes into that. And who's doing the work? It seems to me that it's us. It's the scientist who's going, and you can work through the various biological writings and see the kind of considerations that are going in here to group some things together. There are some similarities here. There are other similarities. This group is missing a similarity. Some things are more, some things are less. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and I don't see it as I can't see it as the active intellect acting on the phantasm. It's us. Right. Oh, except. Okay. The active intellect, as he explains it, is something without any potentiality at all, and that's not our minds. Our minds, we can work, and we can talk about the De Anima for a little while. But I see that John has already stood up telling us that the time is, if we were really active intellects here, we wouldn't need to take a break. And we'd be, so I think there's a certain empirical evidence against your position. Thank you.